if the president declared an organization a terrorist organization or DTO, which is on a secret list, and you were ordered to attack them on U.S. soil, would you carry out that order?
Senator Reid, as with any order I get, I would assess the order, consult the legal authorities to ensure that it was a lawful order, and I would, if I had questions, I would elevate that to the chairman and the secretary, as they welcome at all times. And if I had no concerns and I was confident in the lawful order, I would definitely execute that order.
You were at Quantico when the president addressed the officers?
I was, sir.
So he said there's an enemy within. And he also said...
what you have just witnessed in that Senate hearing chamber is not merely concerning political theater or another day in Washington's endless procedural dance, because what Senator Reid was forcing into the open air for all of us to reckon with is nothing less than the architecture of American fascism being constructed in real time, while Trump described America as waging a war from within, and the machinery of state violence prepares to turn its full force against the very citizens it was designed to protect. Listen carefully to what that general just told us, because embedded in his bureaucratic hedging about consulting legal authorities and elevating concerns up the chain of command is the terrifying acknowledgement that we are now in a moment where a top military official must actively consider whether orders from the commander-in-chief to deploy lethal force against Americans on American soil might actually come down, and this is not a hypothetical exercise anymore. This is our present reality because Trump described the enemy within as radical left lunatics, Democratic politicians, and those opposed to his candidacy, while simultaneously ordering 700 Marines and 4,000 National Guard troops to Los Angeles, amid protests in what amounts to the largest domestic military deployment against civilians in modern American history. And here is where it gets absolutely chilling, because we need to understand what is happening beyond this one exchange, beyond this one hearing, because U.S. District Judge Charles Breyer ruled that the Trump administration had violated the Posse Comitatus Act in its deployment of military forces and described the administration's actions and rhetoric as an apparent attempt at creating a national police force with the president as its chief, which is precisely the language we need to be using, because this is not about border security or fighting crime or any of the manufactured crises that authoritarian regimes always invoke to justify the unjustifiable. This is about a president who has told top U.S. commanders that he plans to use American cities as a training ground for the U.S. military to fight what he called the enemy within, while systematically purging military leadership, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth fired multiple military lawyers, saying that we want lawyers who give sound constitutional advice and don't exist to attempt to be roadblocks to anything. Which is authoritarian speak for we want lawyers who will rubber stamp whatever we want to do, regardless of its legality. The bombshell that should be detonating across every news network and every dinner table conversation in America right now is that the president's alarming comments during an unprecedented gathering of around 800 generals and admirals came as he is increasingly attempting to use the military as a domestic police force while claiming to designate Americans as domestic terrorists. And this is not coming from progressive activists or Democratic operatives. This is coming from Stephen Levitsky, a professor of government at Harvard and co-author of How Democracies Die, who says we've slid into some form of authoritarianism and that we are no longer living in a liberal democracy. And when hundreds of political scientists who spend their entire professional lives studying democratic backsliding and authoritarian takeovers are sounding 5-alarm fires, perhaps we should stop pretending this is normal political conflict and start recognizing it as the constitutional crisis it actually is. Because what Senator Reid was doing in that hearing room was not playing gotcha politics. He was trying to force a public acknowledgement from military leadership about what happens when the architecture of American democracy crashes headlong into a president who views half the country as enemies to be vanquished rather than citizens to be served, and the Posse Comitatus Act that limits the use of federal military personnel to enforce domestic law and represents an American tradition that sees military interference in civilian affairs as a threat to both democracy and personal liberty, is being systematically dismantled through a draft of the National Defense Strategy, which in a dramatic shift from prior plans, prioritized domestic and regional missions rather than combating Russia and China, which tells you everything you need to know about where this administration sees the real battlefield and who it considers the real enemy. And just hours ago, literally as we prepare this analysis, Attorney General Pam Bondi directed the FBI to identify domestic terrorists who use violence, or the threat of violence to advance political and social agendas, including adherence to radical gender ideology, anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, or anti-Christianity, opposition to law and immigration enforcement, extreme views in favor of mass migration and open borders, which is the most Orwellian expansion of state surveillance and political persecution we have seen in generations, because what they are creating is a list of groups or entities engaged in acts that may constitute domestic terrorism by the start of next year, and a cash reward system that incentivizes individuals to report on their fellow Americans, which is literally the informant infrastructure of totalitarian states imported wholesale into the American system. We are watching the playbook that has been executed in Turkey under Erdogan and Hungary under Orbán, and countless other competitive authoritarian regimes being implemented with alarming precision on American soil, because in a competitive authoritarian system, a leader comes to power democratically and then erodes the system of checks and balances, typically filling the civil service and key appointments, including the prosecutor's office and judiciary, with loyalists, and then tax the media, universities, and non-governmental organizations to blunt public criticism and tilt the electoral playing field in the ruling party's favor, which is exactly what we are witnessing with Trump withholding or threatening to withhold billions of dollars from universities, including Harvard, Princeton, and Columbia, and the broader campaign to defund and delegitimize any institution that might serve as a check on executive power. And here is what makes that general's answer so deeply troubling, despite its superficial reasonableness, because when he says he would consult legal authorities and elevate concerns up the chain of command, what he is not saying is that he would refuse an unlawful order, and this matters profoundly because service members have a duty to disobey manifestly unlawful orders, that is, orders that a person of ordinary sense and understanding would know to be unlawful, but usually orders don't fall into black and white categories, they exist in a legal gray area, which is precisely the space that authoritarian leaders exploit by creating legal ambiguity that allows subordinates to claim they were just following orders, while simultaneously claiming those orders were lawful because nobody definitively ruled them unlawful in time. The deeper horror embedded in this exchange is the secret list that Senator Reid mentioned, because what Trump is constructing through his NSPM 7 memorandum targeting countering domestic terrorism and organized political violence, including anti-capitalist, anti-Christianity, and anti-American views, directing investigation into networks, entities, and organizations that foment political violence by the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force, is a designation system for domestic enemies that has no legal basis in American law, because unlike for foreign terrorism, there is no domestic terrorism labeling or designation regime, and Congress has passed no law creating any such domestic designation regime, and for very good reason, it would inevitably sweep in First Amendment-protected beliefs, associations, and speech. But Trump is doing it anyway through executive fiat, creating the infrastructure of political repression that can be activated with a phone call. Because what happens when a president who has already demonstrated his willingness to violate the Posse Comitatus Act, who has already deployed active-duty Marines against American citizens over the objections of state governors, who has already been found by federal courts to be acting unlawfully, decides that the protests against his next policy outrage constitute that secret designation of domestic terrorism, and that general we just watched receives an order to use force against American citizens who are exercising their constitutional rights. In the week following the initial Los Angeles deployment, more than 5 million people joined over 2,100 demonstrations nationwide, rallying under the No Kings banner in one of the largest protest events in U.S. history, one towards rate, and the administration's response was not to back down but to double down, to expand deployments, to fire the military lawyers who might object, to purge anyone in the chain of command who might say no. And we need to talk about the absolutely chilling recent development where Democratic lawmakers, including Senator Lisa Slotkin, Senator Mark Kelly, Rep. Jason Crow, and others urged service members and intelligence officials to disobey illegal orders, saying no one has to carry out orders that violate the law or our Constitution. And Trump's response was to call for their arrest and execution for sedition. Because think about what that means. Think about the fact that reminding military personnel of their constitutional obligation to refuse unlawful orders is now being characterized by the president as a crime worthy of the death penalty, which tells you everything about how far down the authoritarian road we have already traveled. The historical parallels are not subtle, because we have seen this before in every society that has transitioned from democracy to authoritarianism, because the three recognized pillars of fascism are demonization of domestic enemies, preposterous lies, and contempt for domestic institutions, especially elections and the rule of law. Those pillars, all present in Trump's MAGA movement, have historically been bound by an affinity for military values, which is why the military becomes the crucial institution in determining whether democratic collapse becomes inevitable or whether constitutional norms can hold. And what we saw in that hearing room was a general trying to navigate impossible terrain between his oath to the Constitution and the practical reality that defying a direct presidential order could end his career or worse. This is the moment that scholars of authoritarianism have been warning us about for years, because in a February 2025 survey of political scientists conducted by Brightline Watch, the percentage of scholars plummeted who said that the U.S. mostly or fully meets the standard for democratic health, and that was before Trump, via social media, promised to go to war in Chicago, and when Levitsky told New York Magazine that things were going worse than even he expected, asserting, "We're pretty screwed, we should believe him, because these are not people prone to hyperbole, these are sober academics whose entire professional reputation depends on accurate analysis of democratic stability." And the truly terrifying aspect of what we are witnessing is the normalization happening in real time, because Trump began building up the supposed menace of the enemy within that he said should be very easily handled by, if necessary by National Guard, or if really necessary by the military, and by the time he made the call on sending the Guard and Marines to Los Angeles, he began asserting, "We're going to have troops everywhere," and said it might be time to start taking that prospect more seriously, which is the gradual acclimation to authoritarianism that allows each new violation to seem less shocking than the last, until suddenly we wake up in a country where military checkpoints and domestic surveillance and political prosecutions are just part of the landscape. The legal architecture that is supposed to prevent this nightmare scenario is being systematically dismantled because federal law imposes strict limits on the president's ability to use the military for domestic law enforcement. But the Trump administration has attempted to push the limits of those statutes or has sought ways to circumvent them, and when Defense Secretary Hegseth claimed that rules governing when troops may use force should no longer apply to the U.S., he was not making a legal argument, he was announcing the end of legal constraints on executive power, which is the defining characteristic of authoritarian rule. What Senator Reid understood in that hearing room is that once you establish the precedent that the military can be deployed against American citizens based on secret designations of domestic terrorism determined by a president with authoritarian ambitions, you have fundamentally transformed the relationship between the state and its citizens from one of democratic accountability to one of coercive control, and we have a separation between our military and our police forces for a reason. The military is meant to kill people, which is why the Posse Comitatus Act exists, why civilian control of the military is sacrosanct, why the entire constitutional architecture is designed to prevent exactly what we are now watching unfold. And the media's failure to adequately convey the gravity of this moment is its own form of democratic collapse, because when Trump deployed troops to Washington, some outlets dismissed it as farcical and not a likely prelude to full authoritarian takeover, and CNN characterized concerns about authoritarianism as hyperbolic warnings of looming tyranny, which is exactly the kind of normalcy bias that allows democratic backsliding to accelerate unchecked because by the time everyone agrees it is happening, it has already happened. The stakes of this moment cannot be overstated because what we are witnessing is not just bad policy or concerning rhetoric, we are witnessing Trump's 2025 deployments fitting squarely within the global trend of authoritarian use of force to undermine democratic norms, with the dangers being politicization of military deployments and the erosion of democratic institutions designed to constrain executive power. Trump's 2025 deployments marked a decisive break, the use of military force not to address a real emergency, but rather to stifle dissent and assert federal power, which is the transformation of the military from an institution that protects democracy to an instrument that suppresses it. That general's answer should haunt every American who understands what is at stake, because embedded in his careful parsing of legal procedures and chain-of-command consultations is the unspoken reality that he is already contemplating scenarios where he might receive orders to use military force against American citizens, and the fact that this is now a live consideration rather than an unthinkable hypothetical tells you how far we have already descended from democratic normalcy into authoritarian reality. This is not a drill. This is not political hyperbole. This is the documented systematic construction of domestic military infrastructure designed to suppress dissent and punish political opposition, and internal military communications expressed concerns of far-reaching social, political, and operational impacts of the deployment, and that use of military forces posed extremely high risk to civilians, troops, and the military's reputation, which means even military leadership recognizes the catastrophic implications of what they are being asked to do. The question we must ask ourselves is not whether we are sliding toward authoritarianism anymore, because multiple federal judges and hundreds of political scientists and former military officials and constitutional law experts have already answered that question definitively. The question now is whether we will organize the mass democratic resistance necessary to pull back from the precipice before it becomes too late, because history shows us that democratic collapse is not inevitable, that South Korea's citizens rose up and stopped their president's authoritarian power grab, that massive protests can shift political calculations, but only if we recognize the threat with the clarity and urgency it demands, and only if we refuse to accept the normalization of military force against American citizens as just another day in Trump's America, because that general's hedging answer tells us the guardrails are not holding, the norms are not protecting us, and the choice between democracy and authoritarianism is being made right now in real time, and which side prevails depends entirely on whether we have the courage to see what is happening and the determination to stop it before the machinery of repression becomes too powerful to dismantle.